Hello, and welcome to Booked on Shalom World TV, where we introduce Christian books. I'm your host, Clare Hinshaw. Today we're speaking with Father Chris Alar, author of After Suicide, There's Hope for Them and for You. Father Chris is a priest with the Marian Fathers of the Immaculate Conception at the National Shrine of the Divine Mercy. An international speaker and regular host and guest on EWTN, he draws from his experience of being a suicide survivor and counsels many in this difficult ministry. He currently serves as the director of the Association of Marian Helpers and head of the Marian Press in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Father Chris, welcome to Booked. We're delighted to have you here.
Well, thank you, and an honor to be working again with Shalom World and on this television show or internet show. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, well, it's great to have you back. And I'd like to start off talking about the book. You know, early on, you mentioned in the book that the principles could really apply to anyone struggling with the death of a loved one, but you particularly focus the book on suicide. And I'm wondering why you decided to approach that element specifically.
Yeah, that's a great first question, because that's the first thing that we explain when we're giving us a talk or a program on the book. This book could have very well been called After Death, There is Hope for Them and for You. The reason I picked suicide is because that was the most impactful death loss that I have ever experienced in my life. And I wrote from that inner effect that I experienced from the suicide of my grandmother. But yes, to answer your question, it could be applied, these principles can be applied to any kind of tragedy, suffering, or loss, even not death, but any kind of loss, maybe a relationship, maybe a spouse that is estranged. But bottom line that we felt was most helpful was those who have faced the loss because of suicide.
Yeah, no, that makes so much sense, especially in the culture as it is now. And something else that you get into very early on in the book was both that your message of hope should never be interpreted to mean that suicide could ever be an answer, but also that there's no guarantee of salvation for anyone. And I think these are hard things to struggle with as well. And so I'm wondering what caused you to say, we need to address this right off the bat at the beginning of the book, these possible misconceptions.
Yeah, in our Catholic faith, the two ends of the spectrum that you want to avoid at all cost is presumption or despair. Despair is that there's no hope for my salvation. I am giving up because I am a lost soul. It's only a matter of time before I end up in hell, and I despair. Despair was something that many suicides in prior years were viewed by the family because they believed church teaching was that a soul that takes its own life automatically is condemned. On the other side, God's mercy is so great, and it's greater than any sin we could ever commit. We want to be careful not to fall into the opposite extreme of the sin of presumption. That, hey, it doesn't matter what I do. God's mercy is so great that, I'm not going to ever be lost. So, I'm really mad at my boss. I want to get back at him. I'm going to commit suicide, leave a letter, blame my boss, and, I'll have the last laugh here because God's mercy is so great. I'll end up in heaven. We really want to avoid both those ends of the spectrum. We have to realize that suicide, and we don't mean this in any sense of the word to diminish the problems of this life. These are very serious problems. But suicide is a permanent response to temporary problems. We don't mean that those problems are insignificant. They're very significant, but they are temporary. The reason, this life is temporary. So we don't want to make a choice that has a permanent effect, such as taking our life. So we are very clear that it's never the answer. But what we're trying to do is help people that have had this loss to get through it, to have hope that their loved one is okay and that they can get through another day.
I love the way you just explained that with presumption and despair. I feel like I've never heard it explained that way before. And I feel like you just took something that I've always seen as very complicated and made it very simple.
Yes.
So thank you for that. Now, something else that struck me about the book was that you divide it into two parts. You have part one that's dealing with hope for the person who has committed suicide, but then part two is dealing with hope for the grieving people left behind. And
correct.
I'm curious, why did you decide to approach it from those two perspectives?
Yeah, it almost is two entirely different books, but we felt it was important to try to blend it into a single book because it's so hard to get people to maybe come back for the sequel. And the important fact is that what most people explain, believe it or not, one of the highest causes of reasons for suicide is people who have suffered the loss of someone by suicide. That's one of the highest indicators of a suicide to come, is the fact that somebody lived through a suicide, because they despair. There's no hope. My mom or my dad or my brother, sister, or child took their own life. The church teaches they're condemned in hell. What is there good for me to live now? I have no purpose, no hope, and they end up taking their life. So the first thing we did in the book was explain there's hope for them, meaning those who took their life. And once we can convince the people that church teaching is not that the soul is automatically lost, God's mercy is great, there can be salvation, it gives hope to that soul that they can now get through a next day. So that's why we call the second part, there's hope for you as well. Because I'm going to have much more despair thinking my grandma is a lost soul than if I learn church teaching that there is hope for her salvation, and then not only hope, but a belief that she will be saved. Now all of a sudden, I have purpose, I have meaning, I can get through another day, because part of her salvation, as you'll read in the book, as Jesus told St. Faustina, depends on your prayer, believe it or not. Jesus told St. Faustina that the salvation of souls depends on her prayer. Now, she's not God, but he uses the grace through people, other people, like the 4 men and the paralytic in the gospel. It's actually their faith that saved that man on the mat. And so we can give hope that if they have hope for salvation and we play a part in it, now I have purpose. I can get through another day.
Wow, I love that. And you mentioned St. Faustina, and that obviously you're with the National Shrine of Divine Mercy. It makes sense that you would bring the Divine Mercy into the book, but it really struck me how that was kind of the underpinning of the whole book. And I'm curious how you first discovered that the message of Divine Mercy sort of could apply specifically to these cases of suicide.
Well, one of the most fascinating things, and I'm not sure if we'll have a chance to get into it deeply and another as we go farther into the interview, but the whole concept that God is outside of time is revolutionary to many people. When I met a priest in North Carolina, I was doing a general confession and explained that 10 years earlier, my grandma had taken her life. And it really bothered me because at the time I didn't pray for her. I was just not in a good place with my faith. And now 10 years later that I had found my faith, I've had this regret. I had this remorse that when I could have helped her, I didn't. And he told me 10 years after the fact, when I'm speaking with him, to pray the chaplet of Divine Mercy for her salvation. And it totally didn't make any sense to me. But he said, listen, God is outside of time. There's no past for God. There's no future for God. It sounds very weird. But as theologians describe, like Jimmy Akin and others, everything is present to God at one big eternal moment. So if this is Adam and Eve and this is the end of the world, God sees it all at one instant. So God did not, your grandma did not commit to not take her life 10 years ago to God. It all happens instantaneously to him. So your prayers can help her even now. And I'm like, well, you mean I can get her out of hell? No, I can't. He's like, no. God can take the grace of those prayers that you make tonight, even 10 years later, and give those graces to her at the moment of her judgment, right there before the soul separates from the body. Once that happens, it's over. But God can give the graces at that moment because he's omniscient. He knew you'd make this prayer even years later, and he's omnipotent. He has all the power to apply those graces at any point in time. Fascinating concept. Blew my mind, and I couldn't believe we had a God so loving, so merciful, that was the seed that later became my vocation to the priesthood.
Wow. Oh my gosh, it's hard to follow that answer, but I have one more question for you, kind of going into, you talk about in the book both these practical elements such as the stages of grief, things that people could probably find in a secular book, but then also, of course, the spiritual elements. And I'm curious why you decided to combine both of those in the book. Why did you think they were both necessary?
Right, because we are a human person that's a composite. We are not like God in the sense that he is ultimately simple. You would think it's the opposite. God is ultimately complex. We're just this simple, mundane creature. God has created us in a way that we are a composite and mix of psychological, emotional, and spiritual. We are physical, emotional, spiritual. So we cannot leave out those elements. The biggest problem, I think, in counseling today is they only address the emotional. There's very few counselors that bring in the element of the spiritual. And the spiritual is neglected tremendously, even at Catholic institutions, Catholic hospitals. We cannot neglect the spiritual. So the reason we put that part as an integral part of the book was to be able to show God's mercy is the key factor in the road to recovery. And that comes with understanding the spiritual element in the makeup of the human person. One of the example stories we use in the book about suicide is from Padre Pio. Now, this is a documented story in the Franciscan tradition that tells about him being evaluated by his doctor, and the doctor saw that he was praying. Now, what was Padre Pio praying for years after the death of a loved one? And how is it that God can use those prayers even years later to help your loved one years in the past? Let's hear what this tells us. Father Alessio Parente, Padre Pio's spiritual personal assistant, recounts the following conversation between Padre Pio and his physician. Padre Pio: I can pray even now for the happy death of my great-grandfather. The doctor: but he has been dead for many, many years. Padre Pio: for the Lord, the past doesn't exist. The future doesn't exist. Everything is an eternal present. Those prayers had already been taken into account, and I so repeat that even now I can pray for the happy death of my great-grandfather, although he died many years ago. Well, in our human nature, it goes all the way back to our earliest memories of a child. My earliest memories is the word no. So I learned very early that there was reasons. Now, this kind of leads us into the Old Testament and the New Testament, because in language, I first learned no, but then I learned the language of love. And I think we see that in the Old Testament, where God first had to keep us on the right track by giving us what was prohibited. But then in the New Testament, that fulfillment doesn't counteract the Old Testament, but it fulfills it. We learn that why is because it leads us to something greater, and that is love. So the language of first a little child being no, but then as I grew and learned that language, because I was loved, and that's why I was told no, became very powerful. Yes, beginning a book is the research. Actually, the writing part is easy. The research is the part that takes a considerable amount of time and thought. The research has to be very, very accurate and specific when we're writing a Catholic book. And the reason why is because this is not a fantasy, this is not a novel, this is not fiction. And not only is it not true, not only is it true, but it's not just supported by reason. We have to support by church history, by dogmatic revelation, doctrine, discipline. And so we have to do a lot of research into the history of what the church has taught. So, papal bulls, encyclicals, apostolic exhortations, whatever it is, the ordinary magisterium, the extraordinary magisterium, I have to research all of that. And then on top of that, I have to research not just from the church viewpoint, but the secular viewpoint, especially with suicide. We had to study and research, what do psychologists teach? What does, these teachers that have taught in this field, what do they instruct? So the research has to be very thorough, very accurate, and bounced off many people, theologians, doctors, and many others. My favorite Catholic books are history. Warren Caro and others that have done a beautiful job. I love reading about the real truth of the Crusades, the real truth of the Inquisition. But you could also say that I love apologetics. Scott Hahn, Patrick Madrid, others, Stephen Ray, who have given us great apologetics to why the Catholic Church has the fullness of the truth. But then I even dab into a little bit of fiction that relates to the Catholic faith. I love the C.S. Lewis Narnia series. That to me, as a little kid, really got me to relate to who God was, who Jesus was, through the actions of Aslan in the Narnia series. So you could say all types of books, but always somehow relating back to the faith. I like to put when people read, the way that our minds work, they either can learn in a couple ways. Repetition, like if it is studying for an exam, you can do it through repetition. But I feel that in reading, when you read a story, you begin to own it. You begin to be able to just not memorize, but it sinks into the soul. And so when you hear a very moving story, I don't have to remember a bunch of numbers, which I'm going to forget in a couple weeks. That story becomes part of my psyche. And when you read a real powerful one, like, for instance, Stephen Shire, the priest that was killed and proclaimed dead for a few minutes and actually went before the judgment throne of Christ, and then came back to life and told the story. It's one of the most compelling and moving stories you've ever heard. I don't have to memorize anything. I can tell that story from the heart because it sank into the heart. So when you read something like that, it's moving. I think the surprising thing I learned in creating the books was just how much work was required to go into it. The book editing, the censoring, the rewriting. But you know what? What a practice in the virtue of patience and humility. I thought I was a pretty good writer until I submitted my manuscript to some of the professionals, and it bled so much red. It looked, it really looked bad. And I was like, I don't agree with this, all this blood red of the corrections and the markups. But what a growth in humility, working with great editors like Bob French and Chris Sparks, because it really taught me, wow, I have a lot to learn. And I grew from that. And so I think now it was a great experience that our Lord leads you through in writing a book to realize that others can really be beneficial. And I think that's what the spiritual life is about. Don't try to do it on your own. You want to try to get that help of others, because you'll definitely benefit.
Wow. Well, Father, I'm sure we could talk for hours more. There is so much in your book and so much we could expand on, but fortunately, we'll have to leave it there for now. But thank you so much. It's been great talking with you.
Well, we appreciate it. And unfortunately, this is a topic nobody wants to have to talk about, but it's nevertheless important because it's a reality. So let's keep praying for those who have been lost and for those loved ones that are left behind. So thank you so much, Claire, and to all at Shalom World TV.
Hello, my name is Joanne Vonswell. I'm the president of the Rose Mystica Foundation, an artist, and most importantly, a mother of 3. On October 27, 2020, I lost my beautiful, kind, loving 17-year-old daughter, Lane, to suicide. There's no way to describe the level of pain of losing a child to suicide. And even though I've been through a lot of loss in my life, this doesn't even come close to what the experience is. And on top of that crippling pain that my daughter was gone, as a Catholic, I'd always been taught that if a child dies through suicide or a person dies through suicide, that they lose their soul as well. So not only did I feel like I lost my daughter twice, I felt like I lost her. The book gave me hope that maybe her soul wasn't lost. It gave me a roadmap on how I could still help my daughter. And it wasn't just the map being a Catholic. It was a map that was backed by the church teachings and the words of the saints. In the first part of the book, Father helped me understand that God is outside of time, that my prayers today could be applied to my daughter's time of death. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have been so worried, but my daughter had to be in such a terrible, dark place. At that time, my fear was would she not recognize God? Would she not say yes at the time of her death to our Lord, even though she was a good Catholic as well? But Father explained that praying the divine mercy in present time, that God's able to apply those prayers back to the moment of judgment and give my child the grace to accept God's mercy. This book has opened my understanding of God's mercy, and not just for those lost by suicide, but for all departed souls. I was also deeply moved and helped by part 2, the second part of the book, and the story of Sammy, who also lost a daughter at 17. But everything she went through and the shock and the personal journey, I would recommend this book to anyone, because I was a really good Catholic, and these were things that I didn't understand. I wasn't prepared for, and it applies to any tragedy we have in our life. And that our prayers go back in time was an earth-shattering knowledge. And I'm even praying the divine mercy now for my other 2 children. If I go before them, I know that those prayers can be applied back and that they'll receive them at the time of their death as well. Although there's no way to comprehend the loss, this book has cemented my belief that guilt, pain, agony, and grief can only be treated with faith and from the hope of our Lord. And I thank the authors for this book and everything that this book has done for my life and has increased my faith and has given me hope. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Booked on Shalom World TV. We'll see you next week with a new episode. Until then, happy reading.
you searching for fulfillment? Discover true happiness. Stay tuned to Shalom World.